Machine gun fire rips across a stone courtyard. A tank shell punches through a 12th century gatehouse, and the whole mountain seems to shake. Men in American uniforms and men in German Wehrmacht uniforms are crouched behind the same wall, firing at the same enemy. It is 9 o'clock in the morning. May 5th, 1945, the final full day of the war in Europe and inside a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps. Something is happening that has never happened before in the history of the United States military and will never happen again. One American tank, a dozen exhausted GIs, a company of German soldiers who switched sides overnight, and locked inside the walls behind them 17 of the most important prisoners the Third Reich ever held, including the sister of Charles de Gaulle himself. For 3 hours, this impossible alliance will hold that castle against a full Waffen SS assault force sent with a single order: leave no witnesses. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next incredible true story. Join us as we uncover more forgotten moments from history that sound too strange to be real, but happened exactly as you're about to hear. His name was Joseph Gangl. He was not a general. He was not famous. He was a mid-level German army officer who, by the final spring of the war, had made a decision that could have gotten him executed by his own side before a single American ever arrived. And in less than 24 hours, that decision would put him on the wrong end of an SS bullet defending French prisoners and American soldiers on a mountain most of the world has still never heard of. To understand how insane this morning actually was, you have to go back further than the battle. You have to go back to a war that technically was already over. By the last week of April 1945, Nazi Germany did not function as a country anymore. Hitler was dead in a bunker in Berlin. The German High Command had effectively collapsed. Entire towns across Bavaria and Austria were surrendering without a shot, hanging bedsheets out of windows, because nobody wanted to be the last man to die for a war that had already been decided. Soldiers were throwing rifles into rivers and walking home. In any normal sense, the fighting was finished. But here is the part almost nobody knows. In the final days in the mountains of the Austrian Tyrol, the violence did not go down. It got worse. Isolated SS units cut off from any real command structure started turning on their own people. Deserters were hanged from lampposts with cardboard signs around their necks that read, translated roughly, "I am a coward." Civilians accused of defeatism, of simply saying out loud that the war was lost, were shot in the street. This was not combat anymore. This was a regime eating itself alive in its last hours, and the men carrying out these final acts of violence were often more dangerous than anything the Allies had faced in years of fighting, because they had absolutely nothing left to lose. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos sat a castle, Schloss Itter, a stone fortress built in the 1100s on a rocky outcrop above a quiet alpine valley, had spent the last 2 years of the war as one of the strangest prisons in the entire Third Reich. In 1943, the SS had converted it into a holding facility for what the Nazis called honor prisoners. Not ordinary captives, political trophies. Inside those stone walls sat Marie-Agnès Caillaux, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. 2 former French prime ministers, Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, men who had been bitter political rivals in Paris and were now pacing the same medieval corridors. 2 former French supreme military commanders, Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, each one blamed by history for helping lose France in 6 weeks back in 1940. A Wimbledon tennis champion, a Czech sports star, 17 of the most valuable, most symbolically explosive human beings in occupied Europe, all locked inside one small castle, guarded by SS men who despised them. And in the final days of April 1945, word came down through the SS chain of command that these prisoners were never meant to survive to be liberated. The order was simple, and it was final. Kill them before the Americans arrive. No witnesses, no trophies for the enemy. A Waffen SS execution detachment was already being organized to make sure of it. That should have been the end of the story. 17 prisoners, one road in, one road out, no army anywhere near close enough to help in time. But nobody had accounted for one exhausted, morally conflicted German major, who had already decided in secret months earlier that he was done serving this war. Joseph Gangl did not start out as anyone's idea of a rebel. He was a career soldier, a man who had believed in Germany, if not necessarily in the man leading it, and who had climbed to the rank of major the ordinary way through years of competent, unremarkable service. But the Eastern Front had done something to him that no amount of propaganda could undo. He had seen what the war actually was up close, and by late 1944, he had quietly, carefully, terrifyingly begun making contact with the Austrian resistance, passing small pieces of intelligence, slowing down SS supply movements just enough that it looked like incompetence rather than sabotage. Every single day, he put on his uniform, gave orders in the name of a regime he had already decided to betray, and every single night he lay awake wondering if that was the day someone finally noticed. This is where the story tips over into something almost nobody would have believed if you told them in advance. By the first days of May 1945, Gangl understood two things at once. First, that the SS had a kill order out on the prisoners inside Castle Itter. Second, that the only force anywhere close enough to stop it was American, not German, not Austrian resistance. American soldiers, the exact people his uniform had spent 6 years fighting. So Gangl did something that by every rule of his army, every rule of war, and every rule of basic self-preservation was completely insane. He decided to go find the Americans himself, cross enemy lines in a German uniform, and ask them to help him defend a castle full of French filles. If his own side caught him doing this, he would be shot as a traitor on the spot, no trial required. If the Americans mistook him for a threat before he could explain himself, he would be shot as an enemy combatant. There was no safe version of this plan. There was barely a plan at all. There was just a man who had decided that doing nothing was no longer an option he could live with. He was not moving alone, even if he did not know it yet. Inside the castle, a Yugoslav laborer named Zvonimir Chuchkovic, known to the prisoners simply as Zvonko, had already slipped past the guards under cover of darkness, carrying a handwritten letter begging for American help. Two men moving through the same mountains from two different directions, both racing toward the same impossible conclusion that survival now depended entirely on convincing the enemy to become an ally in less than 24 hours. The man on the receiving end of both of them was not a general. He was not even particularly senior. He was a 23-year-old American Tank Company commander named Captain John Lee. And what happened next had absolutely no precedent in any training manual the United States Army had ever printed. When Zvonko staggered into an American checkpoint on the evening of May 4th, exhausted, speaking broken German and fragments of English, clutching a letter written in French that nobody on hand could immediately translate, Lee was the officer called in to make sense of it. He listened. He asked questions through a nervous interpreter. And then Lee did something that historians still describe as either the bravest decision of the entire European campaign or borderline reckless. Without full authorization, without backup, without any real idea of what he was driving into, he decided to go. He gathered one platoon of infantry and a single Sherman tank and pushed out into the dark mountain roads toward a castle he had never heard of 24 hours earlier. And somewhere on that same road, driving the opposite direction, under a white flag, improvised from a bedsheet, was Joseph Gangl. What happened next has been documented in both men's own after-action accounts, and it still reads like fiction. In the middle of the night, at a mountain crossroads, lit only by Jeep headlamps, a German major and an American captain stood face to face. Neither spoke the other's language well enough to fully trust a word being said. A single terrified soldier who had once worked in a Swiss hotel before the war did his best to translate between them in real time. And Gangl made his pitch, not just information, not just a warning. He offered his own men, his own weapons, his own willingness to die defending prisoners who 24 hours earlier would have counted him as the enemy holding them captive. Lee had absolutely no doctrine for this. There was no chapter in any field manual titled, What to do when an enemy officer offers to fight beside you. He looked across the hood of that jeep at a man wearing the uniform he had spent a year trying to kill, made a judgment call with nothing but instinct to guide him, and said yes. Together, they drove toward the castle. What they found waiting for them at dawn was not a fortress. It was an illusion of one. Castle Itter looked imposing from a distance. Thick medieval stone, a single narrow access road walls that had survived 700 years. But walls alone do not win battles. What actually stood between those 17 prisoners and an SS execution squad was almost nothing. One Sherman tank commanded by a sergeant named Kurt Schrader that had barely made it up the narrow mountain road. A handful of American infantrymen who had volunteered for a mission most of their own command didn't even know was happening. Gangel's small detachment of German soldiers, armed with standard-issue rifles, now aiming in the opposite direction from where they had been aiming a week earlier. The castle's Austrian caretaker, who knew every hallway and blind corner, and the prisoners themselves. Some of them decided with a clarity that must have startled even them that they were done being victims. Frenchman Jean Borotra, a former Wimbledon champion, had already slipped out into the darkness to try to find reinforcements, an act of raw physical courage almost impossible to picture from a man his age. At roughly 9 in the morning on May 5th, the SS arrived. And this was not a handful of stragglers who had missed the news that the war was over. This was an organized, fully armed Waffen SS detachment, complete with infantry support and at least one anti-tank weapon. And it had exactly one objective: finish what the execution order had started. What they expected was a handful of unarmed political prisoners. What they found instead was a Sherman tank blocking the gate and gunfire coming from angles that made absolutely no sense for a group of defenseless captives. The first assault broke against the gate and fell back, and as the smoke rolled down into the valley below, thick enough that villagers later swore they thought the mountain itself was collapsing. One truth had already become impossible to ignore. The war both sides thought was already finished, had one more battle left to fight, and it was about to get far worse before it got better. Because the SS force pulling back into the tree line was not retreating. It was regrouping for a second attack, a heavier one. And somewhere on the walls above Major Joseph Gangel, the man who had risked everything to bring this alliance together in the first place, had no idea that he had less than 2 hours left to live. That is where we have to leave things for now. In part 2, we go inside those final brutal hours of the Battle of Castle Itter. The moment the Sherman tank takes a direct hit, the desperate run through enemy-held mountains to bring reinforcements before it's too late, and the split-second decision that will turn a doomed defensive stand into one of the strangest victories in the entire history of the Second World War. The sun had barely cleared the ridgeline above Castle Itter when the first exchange of fire told everyone inside those walls exactly what kind of morning this was going to be. A captain who had never given orders to German soldiers in his life. A Wehrmacht major who had spent a year betraying his own regime in secret. 17 prisoners who had spent years hating each other almost as much as they hated the SS. And now all of them together behind stone walls 7 centuries old, staring down an enemy that had one single unambiguous mission. Leave no witnesses. The first assault had already broken against the gate and pulled back into the tree line. But nobody standing on those walls believed for a second that this was over. It was 9:40 in the morning, May 5th, 1945, and the real fight had not even started yet. What the defenders of Castle Itter did not know, could not know, was that the SS detachment regrouping below them was not improvising. Hauptsturmführer Georg Bunger commanded a force that still had discipline, still had ammunition, still had at least one working anti-tank weapon, and still had orders from a chain of command that even in its dying hours had not forgotten why it wanted these 17 prisoners dead. This was not a mission Bunger's men could simply walk away from. Every hour that passed without a Reich to answer to made these soldiers more dangerous, not less, because men with nothing left to lose do not calculate risk the way rational soldiers do. They had one road up to the castle, one gate to break, and roughly 2 hours of daylight before somewhere in the valley below, an American relief column might or might not be coming. Inside the walls, Captain John Lee did the only kind of math a 23-year-old tank commander with a single damaged Sherman and a platoon of exhausted infantry could do. He counted his men. He counted his ammunition. He looked at the improbable force under his command, American GIs, German Wehrmacht soldiers, who had been the enemy 72 hours earlier, an Austrian castle caretaker who knew the buildings better than anyone alive, and a collection of French statesmen and generals who were by any conventional military standard supposed to be liabilities to protect, rather than assets to deploy. And Lee understood something in that moment that would define the rest of the battle. He did not have enough men to defend the castle in any traditional sense. What he had was a position, and a position held by people who had already decided they would rather die fighting than be executed kneeling, can sometimes do things that raw numbers say should be impossible. Joseph Gangel moved along the south wall with the calm of a man who had already made peace with whatever the morning had planned for him. Several of the Americans who survived that day later described something almost unsettling about how steady he was directing his own soldiers to firing positions, checking sight lines toward the tree line, calling out ranges in German that the American GIs beside him could not understand, but somehow followed anyway, because his tone made the meaning obvious. This was a man who had spent a year of his life in constant silent fear of discovery, passing intelligence to a resistance movement while wearing the uniform of the regime he was undermining. Whatever fear had lived inside him during those months had by this final morning burned down into something closer to purpose. He was not fighting for Germany anymore. He had not been fighting for Germany for a long time. He was fighting for the people standing next to him on that wall, and for the 17 prisoners inside, several of whom he had never even spoken to directly. At the base of the castle road, Kurt Schrader sat in the gunner's seat of the only armored vehicle. The defenders had a single Sherman tank that had barely made it up the narrow mountain switchbacks the night before. The tank was in the strictest sense the entire defense's center of gravity. Take it out, and the SS would have a clear road straight to the gate. Schrader knew this. Everyone on that wall knew this. And when the second assault began at roughly 10 in the morning, it began exactly the way anyone with military training would have predicted. The SS did not throw infantry at the gate again. They went for the tank. The anti-tank round came in low and fast, and the sound it made when it found the Sherman's hull was unlike anything the defenders had heard that morning, a flat metallic crack followed by a half-second of total silence before the screaming started. The shell penetrated. Schrader was thrown against the interior of the turret, his left arm torn open, blood soaking through his uniform sleeve within seconds. The tank stopped moving. For a moment, from the walls above it, must have looked like the single most important piece of the defense had just been taken off the board entirely. It hadn't. Schrader's legs still worked. His right arm still worked. And the Sherman's main gun, miraculously, was still functional, even with a hole punched through the hull beside him. Bleeding, half-deafened, almost certainly in shock, Schrader stayed in that seat. He did not climb out. He did not signal for a replacement. He reloaded, sighted, and fired again, and the round found its mark somewhere in the tree line below. And for a few crucial minutes, the SS advance stalled, because nobody down that hill knew for certain whether the tank was dead or simply wounded, and in war uncertainty is sometimes worth more than firepower. But a stalled advance is not a defeated one, and everyone inside the castle knew it. The SS pulled back a second time, reorganized, and began working infantry around the flanks of the position, probing for a weakness in a defense that from any objective standpoint barely existed in the first place. This was the moment the battle stopped being a single dramatic stand at the gate and became something messier, more desperate fighting along walls and through outbuildings. Small groups of 2 and 3 men holding positions because there was nobody available to reinforce them. It was somewhere in this second uglier phase of the fighting that Joseph Gangel was killed. The accounts of exactly where he was standing differ slightly. One places him near the south wall, correcting a firing position. Another puts him closer to the main gate, directing a small group of his own soldiers. What every surviving witness agrees on is the shape of the moment itself. There was no long cinematic final stand. He was moving, doing the ordinary necessary work of an officer under fire, and then a single round found him, and he went down, and he did not get back up. Paul Reynaud, watching from a window inside the castle, would later write about Gangel with a formality that could not entirely disguise how shaken he was by what he had witnessed, describing a German officer who had chosen in the last possible hours of the war to stand on what history would eventually call the right side of it. Gangel died defending French prisoners he barely knew, alongside American soldiers who had been his sworn enemy less than a week earlier in a battle that the army records of neither country would properly acknowledge for decades. His death did not break the defense. If anything, it hardened it. The German soldiers under his command, men who had crossed over with him, who had bet their lives on the same impossible decision he had made, kept fighting exactly where he had positioned them. There was no collapse, no wavering, no quiet retreat back toward SS lines to explain that their commanding officer had died, and perhaps this arrangement should be reconsidered. They stayed on the wall. Whatever Gangel had convinced them of in those final days about which side of this war actually deserved their loyalty had apparently already taken root deeply enough that his death did not undo it. Inside the castle itself, the prisoners were no longer simply hiding. Maurice Gamelin, the former French Supreme Commander, old and visibly unwell, had asked Lee for a weapon before the fighting had even started, and by the time the second assault began, he was positioned near an interior doorway with a rifle he almost certainly had not fired in years, if ever in earnest. Paul Reynaud had organized the non-combatants, the elderly, the exhausted, into the most defensible interior rooms, doing with a group of frightened statesmen exactly the kind of calm, methodical organizing that had defined his political career decades earlier. And somewhere out in the mountains beyond the castle walls, a former Wimbledon champion was still running. Jean Barotra had slipped out of Castle Itter in the darkness before dawn, well before the first shots of the morning, moving through terrain that would have exhausted a much younger man under much easier circumstances. He was not a soldier. He had no map, no radio, no weapon beyond whatever instinct told him about which direction offered the best chance of finding help before the fighting at the castle reached a conclusion nobody inside those walls wanted to imagine. He found a German unit along the way, one still functioning enough to have working communications, and somehow, through a combination of desperation and the simple, undeniable urgency in his voice, convinced them to pass his message forward. He talked his way through a roadblock that could easily have ended his run permanently. And by mid-morning, exhausted almost past the point of being able to stand, he reached an American column large enough to actually matter. What Barotra delivered was not a rumor. It was a location, a timeline, and a clear statement that American soldiers alongside a group of former enemy combatants were currently defending a castle full of high-value prisoners against an active SS assault. That message moved up the chain with a speed that in the chaos of the war's final days was almost as improbable as everything else about this story. A larger American armored column began moving toward Castle Itter within the hour. Back at the castle, the defenders had no way of knowing help was coming. As far as anyone on those walls understood, they were entirely on their own, fighting with a wounded tank gunner, a dead German major, a thinning supply of ammunition, and a group of aging French statesmen holding rifles in a medieval hallway. The SS, for their part, had begun to understand something too, though not the thing that would have been useful to them. An SS officer captured during the fighting later admitted in an American debriefing that he had genuinely believed, based on the volume and angle of the gunfire coming from the walls, that he was facing a much larger defending force than actually existed. The smoke, the echo off the stone walls, the confusion of German uniforms firing alongside American ones, all of it created an impression of strength that the defenders simply did not have in reality. That single tactical miscalculation, small and almost accidental, bought the defenders time they desperately needed and could not have manufactured on their own. It was close to noon when the sound reached the castle that changed everything. Engines. Multiple engines moving fast coming up from the valley road below. For a group of exhausted, wounded, badly outnumbered defenders who had spent nearly 3 hours convinced that every passing minute might be their last, the sound of an approaching armored column could have meant one of two things: and there was no way from inside the walls to know which one it was going to be. It was the Americans. A much larger relief force moving on Barotra's information came up the valley road and struck the SS position from below at almost the exact moment the defenders on the castle walls were beginning to run critically low on ammunition. Caught between an entrenched defense above them and a fresh armored column arriving from behind, the SS detachment's options collapsed within minutes. Some fled into the surrounding forest. Others simply surrendered where they stood. Weapons lowered, hands raised, the fanaticism that had carried them up that mountain road that morning, evaporating the instant the tactical situation became hopeless. Hauptsturmführer Bunger himself was among those taken. The firing stopped just after noon. 3 hours, give or take, from the first shots at the gate to the final surrender in the tree line below, and in the sudden quiet that followed, the people who had spent that morning defending a medieval castle together did something almost nobody who has written about the battle since has managed to fully explain. They simply stood there in the courtyard looking at each other. American soldiers who had arrived the night before on an unauthorized mission. German Wehrmacht soldiers who had spent the morning firing at their own countrymen. French statesmen who had spent years imprisoned inside these same walls, now standing in daylight, some of them still holding rifles they had no formal training to use. And somewhere among them, the body of a German major who had died defending people he had never been ordered to protect. A photograph exists from that afternoon, taken by an American military photographer who arrived with the relief column, and if you look closely enough at it, you can see almost the entire strange shape of what had just happened compressed into a single frame. American uniforms, former prisoners in the shabby civilian clothing they had worn for years in captivity. And German soldiers, unmistakably German soldiers, standing in the same courtyard, under the same sky, in the aftermath of a battle that had no real precedent in the war either side had just finished fighting. Captain Lee would spend the rest of his life being asked to explain that morning, and by his own later accounts, he never entirely found the words for it. He had expected, if he thought about the end of the war at all, that liberation would feel clean. Victory on one side, defeat on the other. A clear line separating the people who deserved to be called heroes from the people who did not. What he found instead, standing in that courtyard, looking at Gangel's body, and then at the exhausted, relieved faces of the men Gangel had died defending, was something far messier, and in its own strange way, far more honest about what war actually does to the people caught inside it. The numbers of that single morning are almost absurdly small by the standards of a war that had by that point cost tens of millions of lives. 1 tank, a handful of American infantry, a small detachment of German soldiers who had switched sides days earlier. 17 prisoners, several of them armed civilians by the end. 1 dead German major. A wounded sergeant who kept firing a damaged tank's main gun with his own arm torn open. Against an organized Waffen SS assault force sent up that mountain with explicit orders to leave no one alive to tell this story afterward. And yet those small numbers are exactly why the Battle of Castle Itter has spent most of the last 80 years sitting almost entirely outside popular memory of the Second World War. It does not fit the shape most people expect that war's stories to take. It is not a battle between clearly defined sides. It is not a story where the uniforms tell you who the good guys are. For years after it happened, the United States Army itself seemed genuinely unsure what to do with the paperwork and after-action report describing American soldiers giving combat orders to German troops, read to anyone unfamiliar with the specific narrow circumstances of that single morning, less like a military record and more like a mistake in the filing system. But it was not a mistake. It happened exactly as the surviving reports describe it on the very last full day the war in Europe still had left to run in a castle most people have still never heard of. Because a German major decided quietly and at enormous personal risk that the uniform he was wearing no longer told the truth about which side he actually belonged to. The fighting was over by early afternoon on May 5th, but the story of what happened at Castle Itter was in a real sense only just beginning. Because what came next for the people who survived that morning, the French statesmen who returned home to a country that had not forgotten their roles in the disaster of 1940, the German soldiers who had to explain to their own post-war society exactly why they had spent the final hours of the war fighting alongside Americans and the widow and family of a man who died defending prisoners he had never even been formally introduced to, would turn out to be almost as complicated and almost as difficult to categorize cleanly as the battle itself had been. Some of those men would be remembered as heroes. Others would spend the rest of their lives being asked uncomfortable questions about choices they had made in very different years under very different circumstances. And one name in particular, a name barely mentioned once during the fighting itself, would go on to become one of the most quietly controversial figures to walk out of that castle alive. That is where the next part of this story picks up. Because holding the castle for 3 hours turned out to be in some ways the easier part. The gunfire that had echoed off the alpine walls of Castle Itter for nearly 3 hours finally stopped just after noon on May 5, 1945. A single American tank, a wounded sergeant, a dead German major, and a courtyard full of exhausted survivors. French statesmen, American soldiers, and Wehrmacht defectors alike, standing together in a silence that felt almost louder than the battle itself had been. The Waffen SS force that had come up that mountain road with orders to leave no witnesses had been broken, scattered, and captured. But the story of Castle Itter did not end with the last shot fired. In some ways, what happened over the following 72 hours would matter just as much as the battle itself, because the war these men had just fought, their own private impossible war inside, was officially still not over. And in the chaos of a collapsing Reich not over could still mean death for exactly the wrong people at exactly the wrong moment, because here is the number almost nobody talks about when they tell this story. The Waffen SS detachment that assaulted Castle Itter that morning was not the last organized German force in the region. Not even close. Across the Tyrol in early May 1945, scattered SS units, some numbering only a dozen men, others still functioning as company-strength formations, were still operating with functioning weapons, functioning radios, and in many cases, functioning fanaticism. The regime they served had for all practical purposes ceased to exist. Hitler had been dead for 5 days. Berlin had fallen. And yet in these mountains, in these final hours, that reality had not fully landed. Some of these men were still following orders from a chain of command that no longer meaningfully existed, and some of them were choosing individually to keep fighting, simply because they did not know what else to do with themselves. For the survivors, standing in that castle courtyard, the relief of the battle's end was immediately uncomfortably shadowed by a single unanswerable question. Was this actually finished, or was it only a pause? Captain John Lee did not have the luxury of treating the fight as concluded. He had a position to hold wounded men to evacuate 17 high-value prisoners still technically inside a war zone, and no guarantee that a second larger SS force wasn't already moving toward the same castle road his relief column had just come up. Kurt Schrader, bleeding from a torn arm inside a Sherman tank that had taken a direct anti-tank hit through its hull, needed medical attention that the castle itself could not provide. And somewhere in the confusion of a battlefield that had just gone quiet, the body of Joseph Gangl still lay where he had fallen. A German major killed, defending Frenchmen and Americans against his own country's soldiers on what would turn out to be one of the final mornings that particular category of soldier, the SS True Believer, still had the organizational capacity to mount an assault at all. The hours immediately after the battle were in their own quieter way almost as tense as the fighting itself. Lee's relief force secured the castle perimeter and pushed patrols out along the access road, watching for any sign that Bunger's shattered detachment had regrouped somewhere in the tree line, or that word of the failed execution order had reached another SS unit close enough to try again. Radio communication in this part of Austria in the first week of May 1945 was patchy. At best, entire chains of command had simply stopped responding, leaving isolated units to make their own decisions about whether to keep fighting surrender or simply disappear into the countryside in civilian clothes. Lee had no way of confirming in those first hours whether the danger to the castle had actually passed or whether he was sitting on top of a target that some other SS commander somewhere in the surrounding valleys still considered unfinished business. Inside the walls, the prisoners themselves were experiencing something that is almost impossible to fully reconstruct from official reports alone. Paul Reynaud, Edouard Daladier, Maxime Weygand, Maurice Gamelin, men who had spent years locked in the same castle corridors, some of them former bitter political rivals, had just spent the morning as combatants rather than captives. Gamelin, old and unwell, had held a rifle at an interior doorway during the worst of the fighting. Now, in the sudden quiet, these men had to reckon with something stranger than survival itself. They had just watched a German officer die defending them. Reynaud's own post-war writing about that morning carries a tone that is almost apologetic in its disbelief, a French statesman trying to find language adequate to describe watching an enemy soldier choose in the final hours of a 6-year war to die on the correct side of it. Word of what had happened at Castle Itter reached higher American command within hours, and the reaction, according to surviving accounts, was a mixture of relief and genuine confusion. Nothing in the U.S. Army's operational framework for the final collapse of Nazi Germany had anticipated a scenario in which an American tank captain would authorize an unsanctioned overnight mission to rescue French Fifth-Firmer Peas with the help of a defecting Wehrmacht major. Lee had acted without full authorization. He had taken one platoon and a single tank on a mission nobody above him had approved in advance into terrain. Nobody above him had scouted based on intelligence that had arrived in the form of a barely legible French letter carried by a Yugoslav laborer. By any conventional measure of military discipline, Lee had taken an enormous personal risk with his career doing what he did. That it worked spectacularly against a fully armed SS assault force, did not change the fact that in the hours immediately following the battle, nobody in Lee's chain of command was entirely certain whether what had just happened was a triumph or a court-martial waiting to happen. It turned out to be neither, mostly because the war itself was running out of time to care. 2 days after the battle at Castle Itter, on May 7, 1945, at a schoolhouse in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces on behalf of the German High Command. The surrender was to take effect just after midnight on May 8th, a date that would come to be known across the Allied world as Victory in Europe Day. For the exhausted wounded men still standing guard around Castle Itter, this news arrived not as a single dramatic announcement, but the way most of the war's final days arrived for soldiers on the ground, in fragments, through radio chatter, through rumors passed down mountain roads, faster than official communications could confirm them. The isolated SS units, still scattered through the Tyrol, did not all surrender the instant the ink dried in Reims. Some laid down their weapons within hours. Others took days, and in a handful of documented cases across Austria and Bavaria that same week. Scattered fighting continued, even after the official surrender took effect. Pockets of resistance from men who either had not received the order, refused to believe it, or simply had nowhere left to go and no one left to surrender to. For the defenders of Castle Itter, though the practical danger receded quickly once the broader collapse of German command in the region became undeniable, within 48 hours of the battle, additional American forces had moved into the valley in strength, securing the surrounding roads and villages, and the isolated, desperate calculus that had defined the morning of May 5th, one tank, a dozen exhausted soldiers, a handful of German defectors against an organized SS force with a kill order, became a piece of history rather than an ongoing emergency. The 17 prisoners of Castle Itter, the honor prisoners the Third Reich had held for years as political trophies, and in the war's final hours had ordered executed rather than liberated, were now unambiguously free. Not free in the abstract sense that the war's end would eventually bring to millions of people across Europe. Free in the specific, immediate, physical sense of no longer having armed men outside their walls trying to kill them. The human cost of that single morning, small in the context of a war that had claimed tens of millions of lives, was nonetheless absolute for the people directly involved. Joseph Gengel was dead, a German major, who had spent nearly a year in secret contact with the Austrian resistance, feeding intelligence to a movement working against the same regime that still issued his paychecks, and who had died on the last full day the war had left to run. defending people he had in some cases never formally met. Kurt Schrader survived his wound, though the arm injury he sustained inside that damaged Sherman would stay with him. The tank itself, disabled by the anti-tank round that had punched through its hull mid-battle, never fired another shot in the war that had for all practical purposes just ended around it. What happened in the days that followed reveals something important about how militaries process events that do not fit their existing categories. The United States Army did not immediately understand what to do with the story of Castle Itter. Lee's after-action report describing a mission in which American soldiers had fought under joint command with a German Wehrmacht officer against a Waffen SS assault force read to anyone reviewing it without the specific context of that single, narrow set of circumstances, almost like an error in transcription. There was no existing framework for crediting a defecting enemy officer as a combat ally. There was no standard procedure for evaluating an unauthorized overnight mission that happened to succeed against overwhelming odds. In the flood of paperwork generated by the collapse of the Third Reich in its final week, a battle this strange, this specific, this hard to categorize, risked simply disappearing into the administrative noise of a war ending on 1,000 fronts simultaneously. It did not disappear entirely in part because the people who witnessed it were by definition difficult to ignore. The 17 prisoners rescued at Castle Itter were not obscure figures. Marie-Agnès Caillou was the sister of Charles de Gaulle, a man who within weeks would be leading the provisional government of a liberated France. Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier had both served as Prime Minister of the French Republic. Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin had both at different points held supreme command of French military forces. When men and women of this stature are rescued from an SS execution order by a joint American-German defense, the story does not stay buried in an obscure after-action report indefinitely, even if the full weight of its strangeness takes decades to be properly understood. Recognition, when it came, arrived in the fragmented, incomplete way that recognition often does for events that fall outside a war's official narrative arc. Kurt Schrader was awarded the Silver Star for his actions inside the damaged Sherman, a citation that describes in the spare, understated language of military commendations, a wounded soldier who continued to operate his weapon under direct enemy fire after his vehicle had been disabled. The citation does not, and by its nature, cannot fully capture what it meant for a man bleeding from a torn arm to choose to stay in that gunner's seat rather than retreat to safety, knowing that the tank blocking the castle gate was very possibly the only thing standing between the SS assault force and the 17 prisoners inside. Joseph Gangel's recognition came from a different direction entirely and took considerably longer to arrive. Because Gangel had died wearing the uniform of the army that had just lost the war. The post-war reckoning with his actions could not simply follow the tidy path available to an American hero. He was in the strictest technical sense an enemy combatant on the day he died, a Wehrmacht major, who had spent years serving a regime responsible for atrocities that would occupy war crimes tribunals for years afterward. And yet, Gangel had also spent the final year of that same war engaged in a private dangerous rebellion against that regime, passing intelligence to the Austrian resistance, undermining SS logistics, and ultimately dying in direct armed opposition to an SS unit carrying out what was by any definition a war crime in progress, the planned execution of 17 unarmed political prisoners. Austria's post-war recognition of Gangel as a resistance figure reflects this complicated truth. He is remembered today with a street named in his honor in the village below the castle he died defending, and with a memorial that attempts in whatever limited way a plaque or a street sign can to hold two seemingly contradictory facts about a single man's life in the same frame. He served a monstrous cause for most of the war. He died opposing it at the very end. The broader significance of what happened at Castle Itter extends beyond the individual fates of the men and women involved, though for decades that broader significance went almost entirely unrecognized outside a narrow circle of military historians. The battle stands even now as the only documented engagement in American military history in which United States forces fought in direct coordinated combat alongside German troops against a common enemy. Not a liberated population welcoming American soldiers as saviors. Not German civilians surrendering en masse as resistance collapsed. Actual armed German soldiers under actual German command fighting a shared defensive battle shoulder to shoulder with American GIs, coordinated by an American officer who had no training, no doctrine, and no precedent to draw on for the decision he made in the middle of the night at a mountain crossroads under an improvised white flag. What makes this fact matter beyond its simple novelty is what it reveals about the final collapse of Nazi Germany as something considerably messier and more morally complicated than the clean narrative arc most popular history assigns to World War II's ending. The standard story of May 1945 is one of clear lines, Allied victory, Axis defeat liberation arriving cleanly at the end of a long and terrible conflict. Castle Itter complicates that story without undermining it. It shows a regime so thoroughly collapsed from within, so riddled with defectors, resistance sympathizers, and soldiers privately calculating how to survive the reckoning they knew was coming, that in its very final days, it could no longer even reliably enforce its own atrocities. The order to execute the prisoners at Castle Itter came from a chain of command that by May 5, 1945, could issue instructions but could no longer guarantee they would be obeyed, because the men receiving those instructions had, in growing numbers, already begun deciding for themselves which orders they were willing to carry out and which ones they were not. That is, in the end, the deeper story sitting underneath the more immediately dramatic one of tanks and gunfire and a castle under siege. Joseph Gangel's decision to defect to risk his own execution by seeking out American forces and offering to fight alongside them was not an isolated act of individual heroism disconnected from everything around it. It was one visible example of a much larger, much quieter phenomenon happening across the collapsing Reich. In those final weeks, soldiers, officers, and in some cases entire units, quietly calculating that continued loyalty to a doomed and increasingly monstrous cause no longer served any purpose beyond prolonging suffering they had already concluded was senseless. Most of these private calculations left no trace in the historical record at all. Most soldiers who made similar decisions simply deserted, quietly discarded their weapons, and walked home, leaving no after-action report, no photographs, no named battle for historians to eventually rediscover. Gangel's decision left a trace only because it happened to intersect at exactly the right moment with a group of prisoners important enough to generate documentation, and an American officer willing to make an unauthorized decision in the dark that turned a quiet act of conscience into an actual battle with witnesses on both sides. The immediate aftermath of May 5th folded quickly into the much larger, much louder story of the war's official end. Within 72 hours of the last shot fired at Castle Itter, the German High Command had signed its unconditional surrender, and the war in Europe that had consumed 6 years and tens of millions of lives was officially finished. For most of the world, May 8, 1945, arrived as a single unified moment of celebration. Crowds filling the streets of London and Paris and New York. Church bells ringing, strangers embracing in public squares that had spent years under blackout curtains and air raid sirens. For the survivors of Castle Itter, that same moment of official victory arrived considerably more quietly. A handful of exhausted soldiers, French statesmen and German defectors, absorbing the news in the aftermath of a battle that history would take decades to properly notice, in a castle that most of the celebrating crowds in Europe's major capitals would never even hear the name of. The prisoners themselves began the slow process of returning to a France that was itself only beginning to reckon with the political and moral wreckage of its own defeat 5 years earlier. Weygand Gamblin, Daladier, Reynaud, men whose decisions and failures in 1940 had contributed directly to the catastrophic collapse that had put them in Nazi custody in the first place, would spend much of the rest of their lives facing tribunals, memoirs, and public recrimination over exactly what role each of them had played in that earlier disaster. Their survival at Castle Itter did not erase the judgment of history waiting for them at home. It simply postponed it, giving each of them a few more years to argue in print and in testimony over who exactly had failed France first and worst. But before any of that reckoning could properly begin, there was the immediate overwhelming fact of survival itself. 17 people who had been sentenced to death by an order that very nearly succeeded, saved in the war's final hours by a combination of one Yugoslav laborer's desperate mountain trek, one Wehrmacht major's private rebellion, and one 23-year-old American captain's willingness to make a decision with no manual, no precedent, and no guarantee it would work. The battle was over. The war days later was over as well. What remained was the much longer, much stranger question of what this story would come to mean for the men who survived it for the country that would eventually have to decide how to remember Joseph Gangel, and for a piece of military history so unusual that it would take historians the better part of 50 years to properly understand what they were even looking at, because holding the castle, it turned out, had only been the beginning of the story. What came after the recognition some men received and others didn't, the controversies that would follow certain survivors for the rest of their lives, and the decades Castle Itter would spend almost entirely forgotten by the popular history of a war that loved clean, simple narratives far more than it loved complicated, uncomfortable truths, forms the final, and in many ways, most revealing chapter of this entire story. And it begins with a question that not even the men who fought that morning could fully answer. What do you do with a battle that refuses to fit into any of the categories history has already built for it? The last shot fired at Castle Itter faded into silence just after noon on May 5, 1945, and within 72 hours, the war that had made that morning possible was itself declared over. One tank, a dozen exhausted Americans, a handful of German defectors, 17 prisoners who had spent years hating each other almost as much as they hated their captors. Together, they had held a medieval castle against an SS execution squad on the very last full day the war in Europe had left to run. It should have been the kind of story that gets told for generations, the only battle in American military history where U.S. soldiers fought side by side with German troops against a common enemy. And yet, for nearly 50 years, almost nobody heard it. Because the story of what happened after the fighting stopped turns out to be in its own quiet way just as strange as the battle itself. When Captain John Lee finally had time to think about what he had just done, the reality of it must have landed with a kind of delayed, dizzying weight. He had taken one platoon and a single damaged tank on an unauthorized overnight mission based on intelligence carried by a Yugoslav laborer and a German major. Nobody in the American chain of command had ever heard of into a fight against an organized Waffen SS force with an execution order already in motion. It had worked. It had worked spectacularly. But it had also happened entirely outside the boundaries of what any officer was supposed to do without permission, and in the days that followed, Lee had no real way of knowing whether the Army would remember this as the bravest decision of his career or the most reckless. The answer in the end turned out to be neither, mostly because the war ran out of time to properly process it. Lee survived. He came home. He lived what most accounts describe as an ordinary post-war life, and for decades he rarely spoke publicly about Castle Itter at all. When historians eventually tracked him down, beginning in the 1990s, he gave a handful of interviews, and what comes through in nearly all of them is a strange, persistent modesty. He never described himself as a hero. He described himself as a young officer who looked at a desperate situation, made the only call that felt right in the moment, and got lucky enough that it worked. He did not dramatize the decision. If anything, he seemed faintly bewildered that anyone still wanted to talk about it 50 years later. Kurt Schrader, the tank sergeant who kept firing his Sherman's main gun after an anti-tank round had torn through the hull and shredded his arm, received the Silver Star for his actions that morning. It is worth sitting with what that citation actually represents. A young soldier, bleeding half-deafened inside a vehicle that had just been penetrated by enemy fire, chose to stay at his position rather than retreat to safety, because he understood correctly that his tank blocking the castle gate was the single thing standing between an SS assault force and 17 unarmed prisoners. He survived his wound. The scars, by all accounts, stayed with him for the rest of his life, both the physical ones and whatever quieter weight a man carries after a morning like that. And then there is Joseph Gangel, whose fate is the one that lingers longest in anyone who hears this story properly told. He did not get a Silver Star. He did not get to go home and give quiet interviews decades later. He died on a castle wall in the last hours of a war he had spent a year secretly working to undermine, defending a group of French prisoners he had in most cases never even formally met. For a long time after the war, his story sat in an uncomfortable gap in how both Germany and Austria wanted to remember this period. He had worn the uniform of a regime responsible for atrocities that would occupy war crimes tribunals for years. He had also died in direct armed opposition to that same regime's final attempt to carry out one more atrocity before the surrender papers were signed. Neither side had a clean box to put him in. Austria eventually found a way to honor him that reflects exactly that complexity rather than smoothing it over. There is a street named after Joseph Gangel in the village below Castle Itter today. There is a modest memorial. It does not erase the 6 years he spent serving a regime whose crimes are almost beyond calculation. It simply insists correctly that his final choice matters too, that a man can spend most of a war on the wrong side of history and still in his last hours choose decisively and at enormous personal cost to stand on the right one. Paul Reynaud, one of the French statesmen whose life Gangel died defending, wrote about him afterward with a formality that could not quite hide how shaken he still was by the memory, describing a German officer who had found in the last possible moment available to him the right side of a war that had already devoured 6 years of the world's history. The 17 prisoners of Castle Itter carried their survival home into lives that were almost without exception more complicated than a simple rescue story allows for. Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, the two French generals whose command decisions in 1940 had been blamed for the catastrophic 6-week collapse of French resistance to the German invasion, returned to a country that had spent years arguing bitterly over exactly whose failures deserved the harshest judgment. Their survival at Castle Itter did not settle those arguments. It simply gave them a few more years to make their case in memoirs and tribunals, years that Gangel's sacrifice had quite literally purchased for them. Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, the two former prime ministers, who had once been political rivals in Paris and had spent years as fellow prisoners in the same castle corridors, returned to a French political landscape that was itself being entirely rebuilt in the aftermath of occupation and liberation. Marie-Agnès Caillot, sister of Charles de Gaulle, went home to a brother who was within weeks of her rescue, leading the provisional government of a liberated France. She lived, by most accounts, a relatively quiet life afterward, largely absent from the public record of her own extraordinary ordeal, a woman who had survived years of German captivity and a final morning of gunfire on a castle wall, and who apparently had little interest in narrating that experience for public consumption afterward. And then there is John Barotra, the Wimbledon champion, who had slipped out of the castle in the darkness before dawn and run through unfamiliar mountain terrain to bring back the reinforcements that arrived just as the defenders' ammunition was running out. His story afterward is in its own way the most complicated of anyone connected to Castle Itter, because his wartime record taken as a whole does not resolve into a simple narrative of heroism. His association with aspects of the Vichy regime during the occupation years left him a genuinely controversial figure in post-war France, a man whose extraordinary physical courage on the morning of May 5th existed alongside other choices in other years that many of his countrymen found much harder to forgive. Even inside this one battle, in other words, the moral lines refused to stay clean. That, in the end, may be the truest thing anyone can say about the entire Castle Itter story. But the deeper legacy of that morning was never really about medals or memoirs, or even the individual fates of the people who survived it. It is about what happened, or rather what did not happen, to the story itself over the following decades. For nearly 50 years, the Battle of Castle Itter existed almost entirely outside popular memory of the Second World War. This was not because it was covered up in any deliberate sense. It was simply too strange to fit the categories available. American military archives held Lee's after-action report describing a joint defense conducted alongside Wehrmacht soldiers under his own operational command. But a story this specific, this narrow, this hard to categorize, risked disappearing into the enormous flood of paperwork, generated by a regime collapsing on 1,000 fronts simultaneously in the final weeks of the war. There was no institutional home for it. It was not a story about American heroism alone, so it did not fit neatly into the kind of unit histories that celebrate a single side's achievements. It was not a story about German redemption alone, so it made an uncomfortable fit for anyone trying to tell a simple story about the war's moral clarity. It sat in the space between categories, and stories that sit in that space tend to get quietly forgotten, not through any conspiracy, but simply because nobody quite knows which shelf to file them under. It took military historians working in the 1990s and early 2000s to properly rediscover what had actually happened at Castle Itter, piecing the story together from American after-action reports, German and Austrian records, and the surviving testimony of the participants themselves before they passed away. The most thorough account came from historian Stephen Harding, whose research reconstructed the battle in detail and helped bring it for the first time to something resembling the wider recognition it had always deserved. A handful of documentary treatments followed. Scattered academic articles began citing it as a singular case study, not just in military history, but in the study of what happens to ordinary loyalty when a regime built on that loyalty collapses from within. And that ultimately is the deeper significance sitting underneath the more immediately dramatic details of tanks and gunfire and a castle under siege. Castle Itter is not primarily valuable as a story about one unusually brave German officer, though Gangel's individual choice is remarkable enough on its own terms. It is valuable because it offers a rare, concentrated documented window into something that was happening far more broadly across the collapsing Third Reich in its final weeks, something that mostly left no trace in the historical record at all. Thousands of German soldiers in those final days were quietly making their own private calculations about whether continued loyalty to a doomed and increasingly monstrous cause still served any purpose. Most of them left no photograph, no after-action report, no named battle for future historians to rediscover. They simply deserted, quietly discarded their weapons in a river somewhere, and walked home. Gangel's decision left a trace in the historical record only because it happened to intersect at exactly the right moment with a group of prisoners important enough to generate documentation and an American officer willing to make an unauthorized decision in the dark that turned one man's quiet act of conscience into an actual battle with witnesses on both sides. That is the real lesson buried inside this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving toward the ending. The popular memory of World War II understandably tends to organize itself around clean moral lines. The Allies were right. The Axis was wrong. Victory was earned and deserved. These things remain true, and they matter enormously, and nothing about Castle Itter complicates the basic moral verdict of that war. But the whole truth of how that war actually ended on the ground in the final chaotic days before the surrender was signed was messier than the clean version usually allows for. It contains men like Weygand and Gamelin, who had helped preside over one of the most catastrophic military collapses in modern European history in 1940, and who picked up rifles on a castle wall 5 years later to survive one more day of the war. Their own earlier failures had helped prolong. It contains men like Gangel, who served a monstrous regime competently and effectively for most of 6 years, and who died in the last possible hours opposing it directly. And it contains a 23-year-old American captain who looked at a German officer across a jeep's headlamps in the pitch dark with no manual, no precedent, and no authorization to guide him, and decided on nothing but instinct that this was a man he could trust with 17 lives. There is a broader pattern here too, one that extends well beyond this single battle. History is full of moments where the difference between catastrophe and survival came down to individuals refusing to accept the categories they had been assigned. Oskar Schindler, a member of the Nazi Party who used his factory and his own resources to save more than 1,000 Jewish workers from the death camps, occupies a similarly uncomfortable, similarly necessary space in historical memory. A man whose earlier choices do not erase his later ones, and whose later ones do not erase his earlier ones either. The German officers involved in the July 20th plot against Hitler in 1944, men who had served the regime for years before ultimately deciding to try to end it by force, represent another version of the same uncomfortable truth that moral clarity inside a totalitarian collapse rarely arrives all at once, and that the people who eventually act on it often carry complicated histories right up until the moment they don't. Castle Itter belongs in that same company, a small, strange, almost unbelievable footnote that nonetheless illuminates something true and important about how regimes actually end. Not in a single clean moment of defeat, but in thousands of individual private decisions made by people who had run out of reasons to keep believing. There is one more detail about Castle Itter that deserves mention because it is the kind of thing that tends to surprise people even after they have heard the entire story. The castle itself still stands today largely unchanged in its basic medieval structure, sitting above the same quiet Tyrolean valley it has occupied since the 12th century. For years it functioned as a hotel, and visitors walking its grounds had for the most part no idea of the strange, violent, improbable mourning that had once played out along its walls. It was only as the historical research caught up with the story in the 1990s and 2000s that the castle's connection to one of the war's most singular battles became more widely known. Locally, a slow, quiet reclamation of a piece of history that had very nearly slipped away, entirely preserved mostly in the fading memories of a shrinking handful of survivors, and the dry, formal language of military archives that almost nobody outside a small circle of historians had ever bothered to read closely. And this is perhaps the detail that lands hardest of all when you sit with the full arc of this story. For most of the 50 years following the battle, the people who might have told it best, the American soldiers who fought there, the German defectors who switched sides in its final act, and the French prisoners who picked up rifles to defend themselves inside its walls, were simply living out the rest of their ordinary post-war lives. Largely unasked, rarely interviewed, their extraordinary mourning treated by history as a curiosity rather than the singular, unrepeatable event it actually was. By the time historians finally came looking for their testimony in earnest, many of the people who had actually stood on those walls were already gone, and the fullest, richest version of what happened that morning had to be reconstructed from whatever fragments of memory documentation and second-hand account still remained. We very nearly lost this story entirely, not because anyone tried to bury it, but simply because nobody thought to ask in time. So, what do we actually take from all of this? 80 years later, sitting comfortably at a distance, most of the people in this story never got to enjoy. We take the fact that on the last full day of the war in Europe, in a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps, American soldiers and German soldiers stood on the same wall, fired at the same enemy, and briefly, improbably, chose to be on the same side of history, not because any treaty or order compelled them to, but because a handful of individuals, a Wehrmacht major living a year-long double life, a Yugoslav laborer willing to run through enemy-held mountains, carrying a desperate letter, a tennis champion who slipped out into the dark to bring back help, and a 23-year-old American captain willing to trust a man he had every reason to distrust. Each made a private decision that the categories the war had assigned them no longer described who they actually were. We take the fact that this remains to this day the only documented engagement in American military history in which United States forces fought a coordinated shared defensive battle alongside German troops against a common enemy, a piece of history so singular that it has never needed to be exaggerated to remain extraordinary. We take the fact that Joseph Gangel, a man who served a genocidal regime honorably for most of 6 years, found in his final hours the moral clarity to die opposing it, and that Austria imperfectly, but sincerely, has chosen to remember both halves of that truth, rather than erasing the uncomfortable one. And we take the reminder easy to forget in a world that increasingly wants its history delivered in clean, simple, satisfying narratives, that the actual end of history's darkest chapters rarely arrives all at once in a single dramatic moment of collective realization. It arrives in fragments. In individual, private, terrifying decisions made by ordinary people who had run out of reasons to keep believing in the thing they had spent years serving. Joseph Gengel made that decision alone in secret for nearly a year before anyone else ever knew about it. John Lee made his in the space of a single conversation at a mountain crossroads in the dark. Neither of them had a manual. Neither of them had a guarantee. Both of them, faced with a choice the war had never prepared them for, chose to trust something more fundamental than the uniform they were wearing. That is the story of Castle Itter. Not a clean triumph, not a simple tale of American heroism or German redemption told in isolation. A messy, complicated, deeply human 3 hours on the very last morning the war in Europe had left to run, when a handful of people on opposite sides of history's clearest moral line looked at each other across a castle courtyard and decided at the last possible second to be on the same side after all.